I'm Karen Elam, Executive Director of the Levine Center to End Hate at the Jewish Federation of Greater Rochester. I hope that you're enjoying today's lunch. I was actually going to read my remarks, which we're going to say. I hope you all enjoyed today's lunch. I'm Kevin Beckford, co-chair of the Levine Center to End Hate. Sadly, Kevin, who I bet at least half the people in the room know and is a force, he's okay, but he had a procedure yesterday that his throat is really bothering him and he's not able to speak. But I do want to share that I wrote to him and said that we were missing him here, and he wrote me to say, I miss you guys too. My heart is heavy with sadness that I can't be there with you guys today, but I'm so happy to hear that it's going well. He says, I'm still feeling lousy. I'm glad I decided to rest today. So anyway, we're sad that he isn't here, but I get then the pleasure of introducing our closing speaker, Dr. Laura Warren Hill. Dr. Hill, professor of history and Africana studies at Bloomfield College, recently published a new book titled Strike the Hammer, The Black Freedom Struggle in Rochester, New York, 1940 to 1970, which examines Rochester's history of civil rights and offers rich stories of Rochester's protest tradition. We're thrilled to have her join us today. Give me a second. I didn't plan this well. Dr. Hill will speak for about 20 to 30 minutes, after which I will moderate a Q&A. So as you've done in prior sessions, please use the index cards that are in your folders to write down any questions you have. Hold them up. A staff person will collect them, and we'll pose as many questions as possible to Dr. Hill. And without further ado, let me invite Dr. Hill up to the podium.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm not entirely certain I planned my hand-holding stuff either. I want to first thank the Levine Center for having me here today. I want to thank Karen for inviting me. She heard me do a couple of talks with the Genesee Valley Club about the book. Perhaps some of you were there. I've also spoken at community libraries for folks who are interested in the book, interested in Rochester's history. Happy to do this. I want to talk about the work. But today, I want to go a little bit beyond the work, and I want to talk a little bit about what worked in the 1960s and the 1970s, and how we might make some use of that. Today's presenters have just been fantastic. I was struck by how many of the topics people presented on that have kind of hit me in some personal way or in some way that just really resonated with me. The Buffalo shooter, who has been named a number of times here today, actually is from Binghamton, New York, where I've lived for the last 10 years. His family was exceptionally embarrassed by his actions, really mortified. And I found myself not only feeling empathy and compassion for the victims and their families, but for the family of this young man who is going to ask for the rest of their lives, what did we do wrong? And so I think in some ways a lot of the comments that I'll make today are geared towards what can we do right. We're not always going to get it right. Some of you know I have an 18-year-old white boy son. He's absolutely stunningly gorgeous and 6'4", and I'm proud as can be of him. But I have spent the last 18 years trying really hard not to raise a stereotypical white boy. I have been swimming uphill against forces that have told him his whole life how special he is, how important he is, how he was born to lead and be in control and to dominate everything that exists around him. And so when I think about the issues that we've been discussing here today, when I've been thinking about hate, I can't separate out my research from my parenting, from my teaching. And for those of you that don't know, I teach at Bloomfield College in New Jersey. We are a predominantly Black and Hispanic serving institution, and we are a a Pell recipient school. We get a good deal of our tuition funding through the Pell program. So we have a lot of students coming from poor communities. And so all of this stuff sort of combines for me. And I was just, as I said earlier, struck by so many of these markers. I don't know how many of you know it, but historically black colleges and universities have been the victim recently of bomb threats. It's not just scary for our students, it's become something that we have to address in our everyday life. Next to my phone, I have a bomb threat check sheet where there's a series of questions I'm supposed to ask if somebody calls my desk and makes a bomb threat. And there's nothing like thinking about the work you do every single day than to look every day when you pick up the phone, is this gonna be the day that we have a violent event on our campus? Is this gonna be the day when somebody attacks us? On the other hand, I also worry every single day, is this gonna be the day when one of my students can't take it anymore? Is this gonna be the day that the mental health crisis that we're facing as a nation affects one of my students? And so I wanna talk a little bit about the history of Rochester, and I wanna talk a little bit about the book and about what we can learn from it, but I really hope that this kind of prelude to my remarks helps you to understand that for me as a person, I'm not an activist in the way that a lot of people are activists. I don't take to the streets generally. I'm a letter writer. I'm a preparer of food. When other people are in the streets or doing actions, I'm cooking for them and bringing them food. But I have really spent my life thinking about the ways that these issues form a nexus in everything that I do. Hi, sorry, I started without you. So let me go ahead and kind of walk through this. Between 1940 and 1970, we saw a real low point in Rochester's history. There was institutional discrimination. Many of you will know that Eastman Kodak would not hire African Americans. There was a constant refrain in the black community that when an African American put in a resume at Kodak, it went into file 13. File 13 was the garbage can. There was personal discrimination. I wrote a piece that was published not too long ago about white backtalk. The way that white folks around the nation and in Rochester responded to the uprising in 1964. I use the term uprising because I believe very strongly that people were rising up against the conditions that they were facing in the community. The popular term, for those of you that aren't familiar, the term used by the media is a riot. Riots happen at sporting events, they happen for silly reasons. That's not what happened in Rochester. So there was personal discrimination. The uprising in Rochester brought out of the woodwork and excused a whole lot of hatred and intolerance. All of a sudden, because there was an uprising, white people all over the city, all over the country felt like they were now allowed to kind of publicly discuss their racism and their animosity. And then, of course, one of the main causes of the uprising was police misconduct and abuse. Rochester had experienced a great deal of migration between 1940 and 1960. And you can see the top left-hand corner is 1940, 1950, 1960, 1970. And you can see that these wards, this area in Rochester's city center is getting literally darker and darker. This wasn't because of choice. This wasn't preference. It wasn't that black folks came to Rochester and they said, oh, I want to live in the 3rd ward, I want to live in the 7th ward. A number of them said, I'd like to live in Brighton, I'd like to live in Greece, I'd like to live in Irondequoit, and they weren't allowed because of redlining, because of segregation, and because of personal choices. But this history is super important as a visual because we know now that this still exists in the city of Rochester, right? This is still shaping education, it's still shaping housing, and it is still shaping policing. The issue of police abuse and brutality was really gross at this particular moment in time. These images here kind of collectively show the policing of those black neighborhoods in the city of Rochester, the African Americans who lived in them. This picture was taken during the uprising in 1964. The police were literally building a perimeter, a physical perimeter, between the black neighborhood and downtown. So the goal here was to protect the white downtown, to protect Capitol. It wasn't necessarily about protecting people. Here we have a curfew. Police felt completely comfortable going up onto people's porches and to their front doors, telling them they had to get off their porch, they had to go into their buildings. Very famous image here of the state police. I use this picture a lot with my students because I like pictures. I don't know how well you can see it, but this man's wearing a pair of chinos, right? He's in a pair of dress pants. He has dress shoes on. What is going on that he's being arrested in the street in the middle of the uprising? And so this is one of the ways that I help my students to think about current events, to think about the images that we get in the media, in the newspaper. And I ask them frequently to kind of walk through this picture. What do they see? Earlier, Marilyn was describing critical thinking skills. How can we help our students develop them? How can we help our young people develop critical thinking skills when we're faced with the pressures of any mention of race is critical race theory, right? That it's demonized and we're not allowed to have these conversations in our schools anymore. And I like to refer to the 5 W's of history. Help your students, your young people, look at images such as this. Ask them who, where, what, why. And my favorite one is, so what? Why does this matter? What can this tell us about where we're living today? Rochester's recent present. We are facing the exact same issues we were facing in the 1960s. We're facing institutional discrimination. We're facing personal discrimination. We're facing police misconduct and abuse. Because the book has come out so recently, I can't tell you how often I get news stories sent to me about what's happening in Rochester. We have the 9-year-old little girl who was pepper sprayed in the back of a police car. I just, it's so gut-wrenching to me. And I often have people tell me that I'm anti-police. I'm really not. I'm not anti-police. I have police in my family. I work with police all the time. I rely on police, particularly at my institution. I think the problem is we don't do enough to think critically about the role that police are supposed to be playing in our communities. And so it leads us into some trouble. We've talked a lot today about extremism, and what I want to do now is just kind of step away from the extreme fringes, and I want to talk about regular people, people like you, people like me, people who live in our communities, people who we have at our dinner table and who we work with and who we're friends with. These are the most recent crime data reports on Rochester. You can see that between 2012 and the present, robbery has dropped, larceny, burglary, they've all dropped. But there are 2 categories of crime in Rochester that are on the rise. You can see that homicide is on the rise. You can see that aggravated assault is on the rise. These were very similar conditions to what they were facing in the 1950s and 1960s. One of the things that I looked at when I was trying to understand the conditions that existed in Rochester that led to the uprising were how the migrant community, the black migrant community, were being talked about in the media. There were not statistics about who was committing the crimes, but in the media you would see this kind of correlation between the migrants and the rising crime rates. I did not have enough time to kind of go through and check Rochester media lately. It'd be interesting if somebody did that. But I'd be interested to hear what these crime rates are being attributed to in the city of Rochester right now. The other thing that I would offer is that these statistics are often used as scare tactics. They're often used as a way to separate the suburbs from the city, to separate the wealthy from the poor, and to separate Black from white and Latino. And so I would ask you just to spend a minute, just a few seconds, and when you see statistics like this, how does it make you feel? What is the feeling that comes to mind? When you think about this, do you worry about the communities in which these crimes are being committed? They're not being committed in Brighton, guys, let's be honest. They're not. I lived in Brighton for a minute. These crimes are not on the rise in Brighton. They are on the rise in Black communities, in poor communities, in Latino communities. And so, who are the victims of these crimes? Who are the kids that are worrying about these things every single night? And what are we doing as a larger metropolitan area to protect those families, to protect those kids, and to think about ways that we can improve the conditions in our communities? Again, I mentioned this already. Not only was this little girl pepper sprayed in the back of the police car, she had been denied mental health care. I said earlier that my teaching and my parenting and my research is just kind of a swirl in my life. My students right now are facing a mental health crisis. I know that every single teacher out here understands this. They were denied 2 years of socialization, of emotional development, years where they were able to learn how to engage conflict and negotiation and to develop skills. I serve as a associate vice president for academic affairs. I'm supposed to be focused on curriculum development, assessment, retention, keeping our accreditation. Most of my day right now is spent dealing with behavioral incidents. Students are fighting in classrooms. I had a student bring a gun to campus. I just had 8 nursing students, right? Nursing students, the best of the best, acting like a cabal from the Lord of the Flies, you know, attacking another student. And so I'm raising all of this not because our kids, our students are bad people. They're struggling with a mental health crisis right now. I'm exhausted. I've looked around the room at some of the educators. I can see it on your faces. Some of you are exhausted too. We have to start treating the moment that we're in, this societal moment, as one that is a mental health crisis. We need to start better supporting our families and our young people who are on the margins. I have to tell you that today, my partner is at Penn State. He teaches there. He is running a session on it's not the Proud Boys. Karen, who's the Patriot Front, is at Penn State next week. So my partner is running a meeting where they are forcing campus security to answer questions about allowing this group to come on campus. Our students are scared. You know, for those of you that don't know, this is a white supremacist organization. They're one of these that kind of couch their hatred in capitalism and Christianity. You know, making America great again. And so, you know, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but one of the January 6th guys, one of the main planners, is from Rochester. This has a foothold here, of course, as many of you know. I raised this, and I raised the Penn State issue because in my kitchen last weekend, my partner and my son, who's at Wheaton College in Massachusetts, and I are brainstorming, how do we deal with this kind of Proud Boys, you know, Patriot Front organization on our campuses, in our communities. And I have to tell you, I'm actually opposed to counter protests. A lot of people like counter protests. I fear for my students and my family when we start talking about counter protests. I fear for who is going to be killed. And I also fear for which side the police will take in any given confrontation that takes place. And so I was so delighted when I started doing my research for this talk to learn that in Rochester, this was totally shut down. I've never been I've never been more proud of this city. As I said, I was at the Genesee Valley Club a few months ago. They were talking about this event. What do we do? How do we, stop something like this from happening in our communities? And it is a proud, clear message to send to white supremacists. We don't want you here. That's important. And the more of us that stand up and say that, the more of us that organize around that, the better we're going to be. It's so easy sometimes to think that extremism is on the fringe and it's not really going to take root, but we see it happening everywhere in our mainstream organizations now. One of the things that struck me earlier in a conversation with Karen was talking about the Buffalo shooter and his parents, and at what point we stop holding parents responsible for our kids' behaviors and what we can do as communities and families. And I wonder, how many of you are familiar with the game Minecraft? Most of you. I apologize for my language, but I got so frustrated with this game when my son was little, I started calling it Mindcrap because it felt like it was all he wanted to do all the time. But then it wasn't that just that he wanted to play Minecraft, it was that he also wanted to get on YouTube and watch other people play Minecraft, which seemed like way too far for me. And then I started listening to the gamers that he was watching. And I realized that there is a stream of racist, misogynist language that's coming out of some of these gamers. It is a white supremacist space where our kids are being inculcated into this ideology while they're doing something they love and enjoy. And I have to tell you, as a mom, I felt like, man, I have fallen down on the job. And I immediately started having conversations with him about what he was hearing, terms that he was starting to use in his own language. All of a sudden, he started talking about snowflakes. I'm like, what the hell do you know about snowflakes? You're 9. Like, you mean the thing coming out of the sky? And it really had to be one of these moments that we unpacked. And so when I'm thinking about average people, when I'm thinking about us and what we do and how we live and how we move, I want to really encourage you to be thinking about the way that society has forces that are acting on our kids. And man, do I feel really old saying that. But it's the absolute truth, and it's something that I worry about a lot. But there are positive outcomes, and I want to ask you all to continue thinking about ways that you can support these positive outcomes. Shutting this down was a big deal. The city of Rochester has implemented a crisis team, a group that works with the police department to go out on mental health calls. Every city in the country needs to have this. In May of 2021, they were answering 21 calls a day, the crisis team, the mental health crisis team, person in crisis team. In October of this year, they're up to 75 to 150 calls a day. These are mental health crises that previously police were answering, police who are not trained in mental health crises. Many times, our police are not trained in de-escalation tactics. You all live somewhere. You have a police department that is local to your neighborhood. What do you know about how they operate? Do they have de-escalation training? Do they have a person in crisis team? It is your right as a citizen, every single one of you, to ask these questions of your police departments and to make sure that you're getting responses on these questions. If you are more interested in community care in community policing, in looking at mental health alternatives for this current moment, I ask you to look at the Vera Institute. They work very hard to create alternatives to policing. They do work to do program planning and community collaboration. They help navigate 911 triage calls. They staff for equitable responses. I am a white woman who wrote a book about Black Rochester. That's like the elephant in the room, right? So the question is, why wasn't there a Black person to write that book? We don't have enough Black kids in college. We don't have enough Black kids that are going through the pipeline to graduate school and getting their PhDs. We're not doing enough of this work as a society. And so we need to be doing the same things in mental health counseling. We need to be doing the same things in our police departments. We cannot have Black and brown communities policed and taught solely by white people. It doesn't work. It's not effective. And it doesn't end hate. I want to stay on theme. Additionally, they work on pay equity and program governance. They participate in grassroots responses. They help you to use data to guide implementation of new programs. And they work on community-driven programs. I think if we could reimagine policing, many of you probably don't know that the history of policing in this country grew out of slave patrols. The whole point of police forces were to return African Americans to slavery. And so if you think about an organization that starts that way, it's really hard to kind of move out of it. So if you think about what policing should be, a community good, a community service, one that we all pay for in our tax dollars, I think you may have a little bit more confidence in demanding these things from your local police departments. So with that, I want to invite Karen back up to do some question and answers. Happy to answer any questions that I can.
I think we're going to get us chairs, but we'll start standing. Okay. Oh, perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Chaz.
Thank you so much, Chaz.
So, you gave us a lot. Can we get closer? You getting a second mic, or I'll sit really close to you? Okay. So thank you so much for all of that. You give us so much to think about. I'm going to reiterate the invitation to send up your questions. Just raise your hand if you have something on an index card, and we'll collect them and get to as many as we can, but I get to start. So this is not a question. It's something I wanted to mention to you. Coming off of what you just talked about, policing, I had the opportunity to go to the Urban League of Rochester's Interrupt Racism Summit a couple of weeks ago. And I got to hear from Mark Morial, who is the national head of the Urban League, and Dr. Chanel Hawkins, who's our local leader of the Urban League, who I think was hoping to get here today. I'm not sure if she was able to. I just want to mention, take a look at the Urban League's website, because what they shared with us in the session I went to, thank you, was that the Urban League has come up with this 21 pillars for redefining public safety, and it really is about, part of it is reestablishing trust and relationship between police and community, but also one of the speakers said, we can do a lot of the public safety work ourselves in our own communities before we have to call police. So, and that's, I'm literally giving you a little snippet, but I really encourage you to take a look at that report, because it was for me, it was really very eye-opening. Okay, so I want to say that we have a lot of high school students in this room. Let's give it up for the high school students in the room. We're so glad to have you. Thank you for making the time to be here. And we have college students in the room. And so I think let's go. Also, thank you, you're right. So I think that I want to ask you some questions that are a little more directed to young people. And given the fact that you shared that you have an 18-year-old and that you, I know, I have 19-year-olds whose birthday was yesterday. Believe me, it's shocking. And that you teach, you work and teach at a college. I want to ask you this question. Why is it important to understand our history? And how can we ensure that we learn the fullest history? Whose story? Now, that is for all of us, obviously, but I think about young people who are in classes in school and learning history. And what can we do, and particularly given what you talked about, CRT, all of that, like whose story and how do we move ourselves forward to get that full history?
Yeah, this is a great question. My students were saying yesterday in my public history class that they didn't like studying history in high school because history is only written by the winners. And so it was such a great opportunity to talk to them about, again, the 5 W's: who, what, where, when, why, so what. And to start with that who and ask who else. Who else is present in the history that we're studying? Who else was there? Who else was an agent that has been left out of the narrative? One of the reasons that I wanted to write the book that I did about the city of Rochester in the 20th century is that I knew lots about Frederick Douglass. I knew lots about Susan B. Anthony. I knew about Emma Goldberg. I understood the social movements in Rochester in the 19th century, but I knew very little about the social movements that existed in the 20th century. And one of the things about this book, about writing these people back into history, this social movement that emerged after the uprising back into history, was that it allowed me to show that regular people, concerned people, came together and they forced a change in the city in which they were living. They were unrelenting, they were tireless, and they just continued to fight. Many of them are still alive and still living in the city of Rochester today. We don't learn about them as our heroes, and we should. They were heroes. They did incredible work. If you look at the Xerox Corporation right now, you would be amazed how diverse their workforce is. And yet nobody ever talks about the role of the Fight Organization or the civil rights and Black Power movements in Rochester forcing those doors open. I think one of the reasons that we allow the victors to write the history is that it continues to allow them to be victors. If the grassroots, the regular people, don't know the ways in which they have historically organized and acted, then they won't know that they can do that for themselves too.
Great. So, question. Do you think that increased violence reported in communities is because of over-policing?
I absolutely think that increased reports of violence in some communities is the result of over-policing. I also know that I live in a community where I almost never see the police. And yet I know that there is violence that happens all the time. Domestic violence, violence against queer people, violence against Black people, and harassment. Yes, some of these numbers are a result of over-policing. Certainly when we're talking about things like murder, we have pretty good data. There's usually, and I don't mean to be glib about this. My husband, my son's father, was murdered, but there's a body. That's data. We know when that's happening. I think we really need to look at what role police are playing, and are they actually increasing violence in our communities by their presence. And I don't necessarily mean police attacks, although I think some of that is happening. I mean that they're creating a siege mentality. They're creating an us and them environment that leads to further hate. One of the things that many of the people I interviewed for my research said about living in those 2 wards in the city of Rochester in the 50s and 60s was that they knew if the police got them, if they ended up in the what they called the Black Mariah, the paddy wagon, if they ended up downtown, they were certain that they were going to face not just criminal charges, but physical assault. That was part of what they understood. We know that these physical assaults are still continuing, and that atmosphere of violence absolutely increases violence in our communities. And so to your point, Karen, I think that we can all do so much more in the communities that we live in to reduce violence before it even gets to the police. Marilyn noted earlier that the original Black Panther movement was a community organization. They became famous for their slogan, policing the police, but they were in their neighborhoods talking to men who were engaging in domestic violence. They were in their neighborhoods making sure that kids did their homework and had a place to go after school. They were organizing attorneys to do legal defense and doctors and nurses to do medical clinics in their community. There is a movement afoot, and I would encourage you to look into it. I found no evidence of it here in Rochester, but I know there's a movement in Buffalo, and I know that in Michigan, putting the neighbor back in the hood has been kind of a popular slogan and community movement where people just start taking care of each other again instead of living in fear of each other. And that is within communities, across communities, what have you.
Thank you. We're getting some great questions. Thank you all so much. This is a personal question. What inspired you to focus your research and writing on Rochester if you are not a resident here?
I am a New York State chauvinist. I didn't realize that chauvinism was a term that could be used to describe lots of things. I'd always heard it as male chauvinism. But I'm a New York State chauvinist. I grew up about 90 miles south of Rochester in a little town called Savona. I did my undergraduate work at Geneseo. I did my master's at Brockport, and I went back to Binghamton for my PhD. I'm a SUNY girl. I've really lived all over the state. And while I don't live in Rochester now, I did for a good chunk of time. My husband and I lived here in our early together years. My son was conceived here in Rochester. And I spent a lot of time in the city and in the institutions here. It's not my birthplace, but it's some place, to quote Frederick Douglass, that I will always consider home.
So I'm going to digress for just a second because I got note. Yeah, there are a lot of questions, but this is issuing an invitation on behalf of Jill Paperno at Empire Justice, who says, if you have experienced a pretext stop by police, a stop for a low-level violation, pedestrian, bicycle violation that you believe was racially profiling, and you'd like to share your story, possibly for use in a report, contact Jill Paperno at jpaperno@empirejustice.org. Okay. Yes, JPAPERNO at empirejustice.org. And tell me if I'm going too fast. Okay. So I'm going to go to this question. Do you see a similarity of the Great Depression, today's COVID-19, with issues of children and of the Black family?
This is a good question. Speaker prerogative. I'm gonna ignore for the moment the question of the Great Depression and COVID, and focus on the issue of the Black family. Some of you may be familiar with Daniel Patrick Moynihan's 1964-ish report called "The Case for the Negro Family." He was working essentially to try to connect slavery to the conditions that the Black family lived in. What he ended up doing was pathologizing the Black community. He ended up pathologizing Black families as if the problems within the Black community were caused by Black families rather than the social conditions and structure and history in which Black families were operating. And he somehow connected this to slavery and ignored like the 100 years between the end of slavery and when he was writing the report. one of the things that I write about sometimes is the way that our welfare policies have been weaponized. And I don't know how many of you, know the history of AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children. It was originally ADC. And one of the pieces of legislation was that the only families that could get welfare, food support, cash support, were families that were deserving. And so who got to decide which families were deserving? Local state politicians. So if you can imagine in the 1960s, 1950s, who were leading our governments, who were leading our city and state organizations, they decided that unwed mothers and black mothers were not worthy families. They were not fit to receive benefits. From there, we moved into the late 1960s and the 1970s, where in order to get social services, women and children needed to not have a man in the house, right? So they were literally incentivized to not live with husbands, boyfriends, providers, and fathers. So I'm always just a little nervous when we start to talk about the black family as a potentially pathological problem that exists in society. There's no pathological problem there. The problem is the way that our laws and our structures have been set up to disenfranchise and to remove citizenship rights, freedom rights from black families and communities. In terms of COVID, what I would say, as it relates to the Great Depression, is that the poorest and most marginalized people are always hit the hardest when there's a crisis. I study food history. You can tell I like food. I'm a big fan of food. One of the ways that I found I could eat more often and share more meals with people was to start teaching about food history. One of the things that we don't actually teach a lot about is that many black families did just fine during the Great Depression because they had a history and a culture of food preservation and being able to survive on all of the scraps, right? I mean, this is a kind of an amazing history that's just starting to be told right now. So how does this relate to COVID? Again, it was Black and Latino families, it was poor families that were hit the hardest. They're the most represented by percentage in service work. Service work took a huge hit. And we know that they don't have the same access to health care and health services that many other people have. There are questions about the vaccine. This is controversial, and I'm not going to wade in to the debates about the vaccine, but what I would say is that the US government has a lot to answer for in their history and treatment of black communities. Syphilis was allowed to grow and mutate in black men so that we could figure out what syphilis did to the human body. We had antibiotics. We didn't treat black men. That was part of what our government authorized and allowed to happen. So when you start talking about disease and medicine, we can have those conversations, but we can't take them out of that historical context of how black folks have been treated historically.
So I'm going to move us to a couple of questions that are kind of more in the solutions realm, I would say. And this one I'm actually wondering if might even be better for Maryland, but let me ask it. What's the #1 site or organization you would recommend to educators as a resource to teach children how to avoid or combat or fight back against white supremacy online? Definitely a Maryland question. Right. That's right. That's right. Thank you. Yes. So the ADL site would be great for that, I'm assuming that was an educator, asking ADL.org. And it looks like some of our young people are needing to leave. I'm looking and I see we have about 7 minutes left, so I'm going to ask you a couple more questions. We want to make sure that people can get out the door on time. So this is, person writes, so we realize discrimination is still happening. How can young people help end this hate?
I think first and foremost, what we can do, young people, old people, all people, is to identify it when we see it. And I think April referred to this earlier. When you see anti-Semitism, call it what it is. When you see discrimination, call it what it is. My son and I used to do this thing. We lived in New Jersey at the time, but we used to do this thing when I was taking him to school in the morning. I had to drive him into a drop-off line. And we would count the number of black men driving BMWs who were pulled over by the police every week. And that was something that we could track from week to week to week because it happened so frequently. And so for, again, my son, this is never going to be his reality, right? He's never going to experience that. He's going to get pulled over and told to slow down a little and have a good night. That's going to be his reality. So for me, teaching him that the world was not going to work for everybody else the way that it worked for him, and making that discrimination visible to him was a really important thing for me in my parenting. I think for all of us, whenever we see it, we describe it, we articulate it, we explain it. A very good queer friend of mine had dinner with me the other night, and he was talking about a DEI training he did, and there was a description of gender-neutral pronouns where a report referred to he and she, and he didn't understand why this was a problem in the DEI training. And I was trying to explain it's not inclusive, right? If you use he, if you use she, if you don't adopt gender-neutral pronouns, words, terms, then you are not including people in the conversation. You are excluding them. These are difficult things to learn. I'm 46. I'm getting older. Like, my son is gone. Things are hard for me to remember every single day. I'm going to tell you plainly, I have a really hard time not gender identifying people when I see them, because I have 45 years gender identifying people. It's the way our brains work. We put people into categories. We try to understand them by what we know about other people in those categories. There's really good psychology and science on this. But the responsibility is not on transgendered people to do something different. The responsibility is on me. I have to work harder at remembering not to gender my students. I have to work harder at creating inclusive policies in my syllabi. So wherever you are, whatever work you do, whatever organizations or clubs or things you belong to, start to pay attention to what could be improved. Start to be mindful of what could happen. Liam was telling me, I was asking how his friendships are going at school. He's a swimmer. His school is a good school, but he's really surrounded by this group of other white boys. And so I was saying, what's going on? Are the friendships good? Are you guys able to have relationships about your feelings and your emotions, and kind of just worrying about his mental health a little? He said, yeah, everybody's good. We get along great, but this one kid from Iowa, Mom, it's probably just because he's from Iowa, but sometimes he just tells jokes that aren't funny. And I was like, what does that mean? And he was like, well, he's racist sometimes, and he says stuff about women sometimes. And so it was an opportunity to talk about how he and his other friends are negotiating this. And what impressed me, actually, about him was not that he wanted to exclude this kid, not that he wanted to push him out. He understood that the kid was a result of whatever environment and context he grew up in, and he wanted to articulate, it's not about being a good person or a bad person, it's about learning how to function with other people in the environments that you're in. And so what I would say to that question is, wherever you are, whatever you do better.
That's probably a great note to end on, but I'm going to ask this last question because you are an academic and you've written books. And what are some books that can help us expand on what we're learning here today?
God, there's libraries out there on this stuff. For the white folks in the room, I strongly recommend the book White Fragility. Very, very important. We've never really had to confront our race. I can't tell you how many of my white students tell me they don't have an ethnicity. They don't have a race. They don't really understand that white is a race. It is an experience. I think if you're interested in Rochester history, there is a growing collection of books on Rochester history. There is a syllabus. It's called the Charleston syllabus. You can Google it. It was written after the events that took place in Charleston. A friend of mine, Keisha Blaine, put it together with a couple of scholars. I would refer you to that. This is the new kind of thing in academic circles. They call them syllabus. They're really book lists. There is a Me Too syllabus out there, very good. I would recommend that. But any term that you can think of and add the word syllabus, you'll find a list that somebody has created.
Great. All right, I'm going to keep you here. I'm not going to stand up for the closing, but I'm going to ask that we thank you so much with a very, very wild round of applause. Great. Really, thank you so much. So I'm going to just take a minute more of your time. I want to be sure to thank our corporate sponsors, JP Morgan Chase, M&T Bank, Nixon Peabody, Jewish Family Services, and Trillium Health. And again, so pleased to see representatives from each of those organizations here with us today. I absolutely have to thank the Levine Center staff, and I'm not seeing any of them in the room, but if you see them, we all put on these smiley buttons. Please be sure to thank them. Charles C. Chaz, Thomas, and Victoria, without whom this very smoothly run event would definitely not have happened smoothly. It was not me. I want to thank the steering committee of the Levine Center, as well as our new corporate council. We also have some members from the corporate council here. I'm excited about that, and if you're interested to learn more about the corporate council, please see me. As you leave today's session, please be sure to pick up a copy of Dr. Hill's book, Strike the Hammer, which is our gift to you. And we want to invite you to join us in reading and discussing the book. We will roll out details as to how that might happen. We will welcome input from you as to how you would like to have that happen. And I have already asked Dr. Hill if she would be so kind as perhaps to join us on a Zoom or something. So again, please take the book and let's find some time to talk about it together. You'll also find on the back of your programs other programs that we have coming up. Just very quickly, we're going to be showing a screening of the documentary July 64 by the director Carvin Eisen with a talkback with Carvin. That's in January. And there is a youth summit that is being planned for the spring. I'm very excited. That's going to be in partnership with Rock the Future and Youth Voice One Vision out of the mayor's office with Thomas, our our youth engagement coordinator. All of this is on our website, endhateroc.org. Please be sure to complete the very brief survey that you'll see the QR code on your table. It will help us know what we did well, what we could do better at, and what you might be interested in seeing coming forward. If you are not somebody that wants to do it on your phone, but promise to do it, you'll all be getting an email this afternoon, and it will include that QR code as well. Lastly, I want to leave you with these final words. In order to achieve our mission at the Levine Center to End Hate, to unite our community in overcoming hate, we need you. We need you to learn with us, to act with us, to offer your ideas. This is an all-of-society problem that requires an all-of-society solution. Your contributions in the form of engagement, encouragement, financial support, more, any way that you can be connected with us are very, very welcome. We can't do it alone, and we can't do it without you. And with that, I want to thank all of you so very much for taking the time out to be with us today. We look forward to seeing you at future programs. Thank you again so much to all of our speakers and presenters. And if you can stay, you have free entry now to the MAG, which is open till 5. Feel free to go check out some of the exhibits. And thank you so much to everybody.